Okay, so now it moves me to introduce the next speaker, who is Chris Thomas from the University of York, who looks at how ecosystems and biodiversity is changing in the Anthropocene. So welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Yadvinder, and thank you very much to the organisers for getting me here to give a completely impossible task. So I've decided not to try and summarise the literature, but instead I'm just going to talk about how we can make nature great again. So, that's that. So, moving times for the world's terrestrial biodiversity. What I'm not going to do is to describe the huge amount of literature showing the distributional changes of species, the fact that if you've got a time series of a number of decades, you can essentially see the signature of climate change in almost all of those biological communities in terms of both changes of the abundance of species within those communities and predictable arrivals and disappearances. But what I want to do is to think about how we deal with this issue of changing biodiversity and species moving around. And although this has got ecosystems as the headline, ecosystems in the end are the outcome of all of the interactions between all of the species that exist in a given location. So if all the species, the building blocks of communities and ecosystems are shifting their distributions, it is then ultimately that we need to maintain, at least in sufficient numbers, diversity to be able to construct new ecosystems, whatever the environment might end up favouring, which in many cases may be rather different and potentially outside the parameter space that we've currently got. So the species, whatever our future ecosystems look like, with the exceptions of if we invent some new artificial life, all of our future ecosystems are going to be constructed of the descendants of today's species. So here's my garden, and this is quick. Just reminder of the, over a period as short as 15 to 20,000 years, how biological communities have changed. So it started off, I live in the Vale of York, there's a periglacial lake that there was with Arctic char and various other things. There may have been polar bears for all I know. This gave way about 15,000 years ago, following breakage of an ice dam. There was suddenly a great big whoosh, leaving this flat plain of alluvial deposits that turned into a combination of sort of ice age steppe and dunes about 12,000 years ago, which wouldn't necessarily have had mammoths on, but would have had a large mammal fauna. And at least quite nearby, there are signs that humans were hunting large vertebrates in this sort of area. Then as we move into and it's this great sandy soil here, this was generated at that time as part of a sand dune system as the deposits at the bottom of the periglacial lake started to blow about. Then, at the beginning of the Holocene, we get a forest. Of course, I'm completely lying because that's not the forest. Those are willow trees I planted 15 years ago, and they've grown brilliantly. Then it got converted into various agricultural systems. In came weeds of agriculture, things like poppies that came from southern Europe and from the western parts of Asia. We now call these wild flowers and we protect them. And then most recently we've had things like, now it's used for recreation, it's a horse pasture and hayfield. With each of these arrows, we have had a near complete change in all of the species that are present And although there are a few that have hung on right throughout this, there's clearly enormously different ecosystems, different sets of species, but humans have interacted with each of these, and in their time, I can imagine these hunters here being extremely angry by the arrival of these trees that were ruining their hunting grounds. But it generated a forest ecosystem, this happened across lots of Europe, that humans then interacted with, and indeed we've built our culture effectively out of harvesting these trees. So we are now in a situation where at least about, say, half of the climate change's worth that has taken place between the top and bottom of this graph is happening not over thousands of years, but over a century. And so this is why I think it's so relevant to think about this changing kaleidoscope of ecosystems and our interactions with them, because it's a similar sort of magnitude of potential change. In the last few decades, bunches of new species, every year pretty much, I find new species that have colonized my field and they're moving northwards predominantly. So the system, what we now have in terms of the opportunities are to think about how are we as humans in multiple ways, whether it's to produce our food or to protect wildlife or keep carbon in ecosystems, how are we as humans going to interact with this sort of changing kaleidoscope of biodiversity, changing ecosystems? And so what you can think of is any region, you could call this an ecosystem, you could call it a county or some other boundary that could be a country which has some legislative governance. And in each of these areas, we've got novel regional communities that are coming into existence. We've got evolution in relation to the physical environment, for example, which will include the local geology as well as the new climate and photoperiod and so on. And then we've got coevolution between the species that have all turned up in this new place. So this could be quite a big region, or you could think of it as quite a localized area. And human interactions, of course, are affecting what goes on in this new community. Human actions via the introduction of species, through species that are responding to climate change, through modification of habitat in other ways, species are moving into this new regional biological assemblage, and species are moving out. So if we as humans are thinking about what are the opportunities, well, one of the opportunities is to try and prevent loss. And if you have legislated that some protected area requires protection because some species exist in it, then you might put quite a lot of effort into trying to keep it there. So the difficulty is, though, is which species are you going to try and save when the environment is no longer suitable for them? And why are you doing it? Is it because of your cultural attachment to that species and that location, or is it actually a globally endangered species? And what concerns me most, I think, about conservation spending and effort in the modern era is that we might spend a lot of our effort almost pissing it away, if you excuse my language, on trying to stop what is ultimately unstoppable. We can also think about all the different ways, and there's masses of them, of managing ecosystems and species, but it's very difficult for us, I would argue, to determine what are the priorities for this new dynamic system. We can kind of recognize what something was like a few decades ago, let's say, and think, well, it was just so. But if we know it's not going to be the same in the future, how do we set the priority for how we would most like it to be? Because we know for sure it's not just going to be because of climate that it's going to take its new form. It's going to be because of all of these interacting things. So I think that people have been concentrating, at least in their worries, those pessimists of the morning, with the losses of things. But in fact, we might be more successful about thinking about the facilitating of expansions, which we might be able to bring in new species, but who's going to decide which species? How are we going to do it? We don't have legislative frameworks across easier here where there's one or two rather big countries, but in Europe where you've got lots of different countries, this is really quite challenging because it means moving things across national boundaries that gets into politics. So these are real challenges, but if you were concerned about, if we were to take Tim's talk earlier about ecosystem potential sort of transitions, is it, if an areas get drier, that's forest? Do we want to be importing lots of dry forest species of tree to maintain a forest ecosystem? Which some people might say, well, this is a bad thing because you're going to displace the community that was there, but it might be the way that you can maintain at least a forest system if that's what you want to do. So if you think of sort of broad strategies that we have in conservation, we've got sort of planning stuff, which I've separated out from traditional in situ, ex situ conservation, and what I'm terming trans situ conservation, in which I'm including stepping stones, corridors, as well as actually physically moving organisms from one location to another. So this is a sort of, obviously in situ conservation's been the most important thing, but recent sort of our planning has often been about a static system, where sort of, you know, if you think of your conservation, your spatial conservation planning tools will tend to, if you put in climate change or something like that, it's relatively minor dynamics. So the main thinking has been about local protection of local things, priority areas, and if you like, holding the line. But clearly, people are now moving into this space of dynamic thinking. But once you start thinking dynamically, then in what way should we encourage dynamics? When should we embrace novel ecosystems that are unlike any we've had before, the co-benefits issues? And most important, perhaps of all, is a global scale of thinking, because it's that global thinking, because if we're trying to keep the species or the genes, the building blocks of diversity and eventually, ultimately, ecosystems in place, then we have to think about keeping our total set as intact as possible. And so maybe we should be concentrating on the organisms that are globally endangered in some way, rather than trying to maintain the populations of the things that could be significant locally but are not globally threatened. Well, I'm not going to go through all this in detail. We're going to need lots of in situ conservation. We're going to need ex situ conservation as well. I love gene banks from frozen zoos, but they don't deliver a vast number of ongoing ecosystem services every day of the week. So, it's useful. We should do it. But ultimately, if we want ecosystems to be transformed into new things that are going to fulfill all of the ecosystem goods and services that we might wish under the new environmental conditions, then we need a mental shift to accept this. We need things like connected landscapes, so we've already had some discussion of this, and potentially even the translocation of species. But here we just don't have the legislative frameworks or guidelines to do it at the moment. So, if you like, think globally, act locally, but actually we also need to act globally. This character was supposed to have come up with this, or at least this type of thinking, first of all. So, if we put this in more stuffy language, we need to think about the spatial and temporal scales of our priorities, of our governance, and our responses. And the Convention on Biological Diversity here is quite challenging because everyone gets together every so often, has a lovely time, and develops high-level goals. The problem is then that the delivery of these goals is largely devolved to individual countries or other entities for the specific development of country-specific goals and their implementation. And of course, if you've been told you've got to stop the decline of biodiversity, what do? You go home and you make a list of the species you've got, and if possible, how widespread they are and how abundant they are, and you make a list of your current ecosystems and where they are, and that then forms effectively your baseline against which you can measure whether you're managing to slow the rate of decline or even halt decline. The problem is if you, in the context of climate change, you set a baseline like that, you're going to fail because ultimately, we, as the climate changes, we are going to move further and further away from the current exact distributions of species, the exact composition of biological communities. So we need to have our targets as ones that are flexible, that don't have to decline just because species distributions are changing. And to give you a kind of example of the things that, of where this comes a problem, is there's a whole bunch, there's a whole bunch of small range water beetles, and I've just highlighted with the red circles here the ones that are at high elevation. You can see on this left-hand panel here, that's snow on the tops of the mountains. So these water beetles are fed by the melting snow, the streams, and there's a bunch of endemic species. So there's 2 endemic species and 2 endemic subspecies on the Sierra Nevada there, the real one. So what do? Well, you could move them to the Pyrenees, I suppose. You could move them to wet Wales, if you liked, and surely no one would notice. But this is seen effectively as a Spanish problem. In Britain, though, I've just been involved, as a number of others have, in a UK risk assessment of, but it's of UK species. And we haven't done the risk assessment for all European species to ask which are the European species that are endangered as entire species that might be able to live in Britain as the future. And so it's that kind of thinking that is very challenging and we're currently largely failing at. And then we're getting new biological communities. This is an old favourite. Camille knows all about this one. In the foothills of the Alps, where we've got broadleaf evergreens coming in from Asia, from North America, some even from Australasia, that are combining with climate change to generate novel ecosystems of mixtures, of effectively an international mixture of species. It's still fulfilling what you might regard as ecosystem functions, but it's different. If you like, it's a novel anthrome. What are we going to do with this? Well, here's a local response. This is now a climate where broadleafed evergreens are doing well, and there's a whole bunch of species there from all around the world that like this kind of environment. So what do? We cut a hole in the vegetation and we plant these saplings of linden trees, lime trees, tilia, to maintain the traditional ecosystem. And this, you can do it for a bit if you like, as a cultural thing, but we can't micromanage every species and habitat around the world like this. So the challenge is how far we're going to think into the future and how we think about these things as a moving target, what future we're thinking about. But I think, above all, we should always be thinking about changes in biodiversity and our composition of communities as a balance of gains and losses. And it's as relevant to us to think about the processes that deliver gains to ecosystems as it is losses, if we're going to have a viable strategy in the future. So, of course, though, the most important thing is to address the fundamental causes of climate mitigation. We'd be completely stupid to not to do that. But we are going to have to do adaptation, or at least virtually every conservationist in the world is going to think we need to do some kind of adaptation. What we need to do is to be very careful we don't spend nearly a lot of our money treating symptoms when actually those symptoms of biological change are an illustration of how our ecosystems and diversity is actually adjusting to the new system, just as it did at the beginning of the Holocene. But what these do is to provide us with a whole series of opportunities whereby we could embrace new systems, but we need to be brave in some circumstances and not assume that they all have to be like those that existed in the past. Thank you very much. Yep, Pete.
Hi, Chris. Pete Smith, University of Aberdeen. It's a question born out of ignorance, but taking the example of the Spanish water beetles, if you move them from there and put them up on the tops of mountains in Wales, is there a risk of a whole bunch of unintended consequences on the local ecosystem? Is that a sort of a dangerous thing to do?
I'll respond to that in two ways. The first is that no change in our biological systems is not on the table, and that all of our ecosystems at the moment are receiving new immigrants of new species that are very often quite widespread, often but not always generalist species that are able to move across the landscapes and exploit the new conditions. And therefore, if you add a number of international rarities, it's not evident to me that that's necessarily a higher risk than all the other species that are coming in anyway without intervention. And the second thing is that, as Dove Sachs at the back will be able to elaborate on, that when most species turn up in most new parts of the world, they don't displace existing species. In other words, the ratio of arrivals to disappearances is well over a tiny fraction, on average in continental areas. Each new species arrives, at most a tiny fraction of an existing species disappears. And in Britain, we've had about maybe in the last 1,000 years, we've had about 2,000 non-native species of animals, and about 3/4 of them are plants, have arrived in Britain. There is no documented species-level extinction as a direct consequence of all of those new arrivals. Some have died out for other reasons, because of habitat loss or whatever, or over-exploitation, but not because of the new arrivals. And having arrived, a number of those species have then hybridized and generated new species that only exist on this planet because of humans. So the net result of all of the immigrants to Britain has actually been to increase the number of species on the planet. Yeah.
Hi, Nick Graham, Lancaster University. You're talking a lot about, I guess, species on the move and species moving towards the poles. What about equatorial ecosystems, where new arrivals aren't really happening, and degradation of ecosystems, such as coral reefs in equatorial zones? There's winners and losers, of course, in terms of which species do better and which do worse. But new arrivals isn't really occurring because reefs are tropicalizing in the subtropics, but equatorial reefs are not seeing species turnover from movement.
There's a huge amount of uncertainty, particularly for the wettest, hot parts of the world, like the hottest, wettest bits of Amazonia, for example, is if it gets hotter and perhaps even wetter, then what are the species that are going to move in, if any? And they're known to be a number of those species are known to be quite close to their thermal limits. So knowing what is going to happen, whether we're going to have a collapse of biodiversity in the most species-rich bits of the planet, we don't have the research to determine yet. This is a gap. On the other hand, we do know, for example, in Drosophila, that the dry lands, the species that are in drier environments in the tropics, do have higher thermal maxima. And so there are actually species out there on the planet that could survive under the new thermal conditions, perhaps. Now, if we're considering species-level extinctions, which is actually what because everything's going to be on the move, is what I think about the most, then the majority of tropical extinctions at the species level are likely to be in tropical montane areas where you've got small range species which effectively are running out of somewhere to go, and there's lots of evidence of species moving uphill now and in some cases disappearing from high elevations on mountain ranges. So one option is indeed to think about moving some of those species to either higher ranges or to ones that are slightly more temperate in their distribution. But the evidence base, you can identify potentially the things at risk, but then you need to put in the monitoring, because as Camille was saying, there is such a diversity of response to find out which are responding by declining before you would really have a good shopping list of what to move. So it's hard, but that in the areas of the montane tropics, there is an input of new species from the lowlands. Sorry, Camille?
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on your assertion that Britain hasn't had any extinctions due to exotics coming in, barring habitat loss and all the other things. And I would argue that it's because Britain has such a long, cold, dark, wet winter that most exotics that come in can just sort of barely hang on. But as England becomes warmer and drier, you will start having exotics becoming truly invasive.
But that is, but the things that we call invasive are things that have become quite common. But all of the things that we've got at common and widespread have arrived in the Holocene as well. They are recent arrivals in the geological past. So are we really saying that we're only allowing foreign species in if they will stay nice, well-behaved and rare? And I just don't think it's viable. Rhododendron ponticum, admittedly with a few, alas, American genes hybridized with it, the Rhododendron ponticum is very widespread. It comes actually from a subspecies in the Iberian Peninsula. It's done very well in Britain. So we've saved that subspecies from climate change effectively by the Victorians bringing it in, planting it. It's now romping across parts of the countryside, but not all of them, only certain soils. And the result of this, though, is people dislike it so much, even though it's absolutely beautiful. They dislike it so much that we're spending more money on trying to exterminate this plant that we've already saved from climate change than on any other extermination project in the country. So it's bizarre. That's why I say no change is not on the table. You've got to accept that some of the new things are common, and some of the new species that nip across the channel on their own are also going to be common. But I agree, there's a key thing about the new communities that come into exist and which species are common are going to be a function of the interaction between climate and invasions, translocation of species, nitrogen deposition, all the other things that are in existence. Then they can't be looked at in isolation. Nancy.
Pushing the wrong thing. Nancy Knowlton, Smithsonian. I'd like to make a couple of comments, not so much directed at the specific accuracy of what you're saying, but more about how it would be interpreted outside this room. Because I think that's part of what we have to think about as scientists, not just how we talk among ourselves. In terms of the invasive species question, I think it's important to remember that even if things don't go extinct, invasive species can have really substantial impacts on diversity and ecosystem function. And the invasive seaweeds in the Mediterranean or invasive lionfish in the Caribbean are both examples where invasive species have had really quite detrimental effects, and invasive predators have, certainly on islands, caused extinction. So I think it's really important to make clear, what we mean when we say that, more things coming is great. And just more generally speaking, this refers, I was thinking about this in the previous panel as well. I mean, and I'm speaking here as someone who really focuses on trying to find the bright spots in the climate narrative. But I think we have to be careful when we talk about this between, distinguishing between sort of embracing hope and embracing complacency. And I think we have to be careful when we talk about embracing change versus embracing catastrophe. And, and the elements of all those things are sort of floating around today. And I guess I would just, and was one thing to say, in this room, oh, this is the mitigation adaptation story. Everybody in the room knows what you're talking about, but I suspect a lot of people outside the room don't even know what mitigation means. So they probably have a general sense of what adaptation means. So it's just how we manage that balance, both in terms of, making decisions about what to do and how we communicate what we're trying to do, I think is really critical.
I'm going to go red in 2 seconds, so that escapes me. But what I would just say again is that change is going to happen. It is a matter of the extent to which we decide we wish to intervene in that change. And I do not, from any area, and I accept completely extinction in islands, and I'll say island-like environments like lakes that are full of endemic fish or whatever it is, but I don't see that as happening across continental areas. You're the expert in marine systems. I do believe since the Red Sea got a slight connection to the Mediterranean has actually gained species rather than lost it. So pretty much every country, terrestrial country in the world, as far as we know, contains more species than it did a couple of hundred years ago as a result of all of these imports. That isn't to say that we decide as societies we wish to have a world like that, but that appears to be the direction of travel at the moment.
I guess I'm just trying to say that there's more to the calculation than the total number of species. There's the functional attributes of the ecosystems, and not only just in the general sense.
Globally about keeping as many species in the game as possible.